The following story is a work of fiction intended for entertainment purposes only. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.
My father used to say that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one holding the gun, but the one holding the ledger. He spent 40 years building our family office on Park Avenue into a fortress of old-school trust and ironclad ethics. He told us that a family name is like a skyscraper. It takes 3 generations of backbreaking work to build it up, but it only takes one person with a match to burn it down to the foundation. I never really understood what he meant until the day I found a signature with my name on it, written in a pen I've never owned, authorizing a $12 million wire transfer to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. That was the moment I realized my brother Josh wasn't just my business partner anymore. He was the guy holding the match, and he was planning on letting me take the blame for the smoke. To understand how we got here, you have to understand the dynamic between me and Josh. We were the classic New York legacy story, or at least that's what the brochures for the firm made it look like. Josh was the older brother, the golden boy, who excelled at everything that looked good on a resume. He was the captain of the rowing team at Yale, the guy who could walk into a room of billionaires and have them laughing at his jokes within 30 seconds. He had this effortless charisma that made people want to give him their money. I was the younger brother, the ghost of the firm. While Josh was out at the Hamptons or playing golf at Shinnecock Hills to bring in new business, I was the one actually running the office. I was the one who understood the tax codes of 3 different continents. I was the one who could spot a decimal point error in a 300-page audit. I didn't mind the shadows. Honestly, I preferred them. I liked the logic of the numbers. They didn't lie. They didn't have egos, and they didn't care about which prep school you went to. When my father retired 5 years ago, he did something that surprised everyone. He didn't name Josh the sole head of the firm. He split it 50-50. He told us we were 2 halves of a whole, that Josh was the engine and I was the steering wheel. At the time, I thought it was a beautiful sentiment. Now looking back, I realize my father knew exactly who Josh was. He knew that without me, Josh would drive the family name off a cliff just to see how fast the car could go. The first year was fine. We were the dashing duo of Park Avenue. But then the lifestyle started to shift. It was subtle at first. Josh started showing up to the office at noon, smelling like expensive gin and the ocean. He bought a penthouse in Tribeca that cost more than some of our clients' net worth. Then came the custom-built Porsche and the collection of Patek Philippe watches that he'd show off during partner meetings. I remember asking him once during a late-night session where I was closing a merger how he was suddenly affording all of this. He just laughed, leaning back in his Italian leather chair, and told me he'd made some aggressive moves in the crypto market. He told me to stop being such a boring accountant and start living a little. I wanted to believe him. You have to understand, Josh wasn't just my brother. He was my best friend. We'd survived our mother's long illness together. We'd stood shoulder to shoulder at our father's retirement party, promising to keep the legacy alive. You don't want to believe that the person you grew up with is capable of looking you in the eye and lying every single day. The cracks in the foundation started appearing about 6 months ago. It began with the Sterling Trust. This wasn't just any account. The Sterlings were our oldest clients. The patriarch had been my father's roommate at Harvard, and when he passed away, he left his entire estate in our hands to provide for his widow, Eleanor. Eleanor is 85 years old, one of the sweetest women you'll ever meet, and she trusted us implicitly. I was doing a routine internal audit on a quiet Saturday morning. I like the office when it's empty. The hum of the air conditioning and the view of Central Park makes everything feel manageable. I was deep into the quarterly management fees when I noticed something off. It was a transfer of $50,000 labeled as administrative consultative fees. It was a small amount in the grand scheme of the Sterling estate, but we don't have a consultative fee that high. Not without my sign-off. I went into the digital archives to find the authorization, and there it was, my digital signature. The timestamp showed it was signed at 11:45 p.m. on a Friday night 3 weeks prior. I felt a weird chill go down my spine because I remember that Friday perfectly. I'd been at the New York Public Library for a charity gala. I hadn't even opened my laptop that night. I figured it was a glitch. Maybe a junior associate had used the wrong template. I called Josh on Monday morning and asked him to come into my office. He walked in looking like $1,000,000, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car. He didn't even sit down. He just stood there, checking his watch, and asked me what was so urgent. I showed him the Sterling transfer. I told him someone had used my signature and that we needed to track down which associate was being sloppy. I expected him to be annoyed, maybe even concerned about the security breach. Instead, he just let out this short, sharp laugh. He told me it was probably just a clerical error from the bookkeeping department and that I should stop being such a micromanager. He said, "Look, I probably mentioned the fee to the associates and they just pushed it through. I'll have them fix it, okay? Don't stress Eleanor over 50 grand. He gave me that classic Josh grin, the one that used to make me feel like everything was under control, and he walked out. But for the first time in my life, that grin felt like a mask. A week later, I checked the Sterling account again. The 50,000 wasn't back. In fact, another 100,000 was gone, and this time it wasn't just a consultative fee. It was a direct wire to a company called Luminance Holdings. I searched our database. We didn't have a client or a vendor by that name. My heart started racing. I didn't go to Josh this time. I stayed late, way past the time the cleaning crews left, and I did something I'd never done before. I bypassed the main server security and accessed the back-end logs of our document signing software. I wanted to see the IP address of the device that had authorized that transfer with my name. I remember staring at the screen for a long time, the blue light reflecting off my glasses. The IP address didn't belong to a hacker in Eastern Europe. It didn't belong to a rogue associate. It was the static IP for the desktop computer in the corner office, Josh's office. I sat there in the dark, and for the first time, the silence of the building felt heavy. It felt like the walls were closing in. My brother wasn't just stealing money from an 85-year-old widow. He was using my credentials to do it. He was systematically building a paper trail that made me the architect of the theft. If the Sterlings ever caught on, or if a federal auditor walked through those doors, they wouldn't see the guy in the Porsche. They would see the ghost, the meticulous younger brother who had authorized every single dollar of the theft. I realized then that this wasn't just a lapse in judgment. This was a long con. Josh had spent the last 2 years setting the stage, making me the face of the operations while he became the face of the brand. He knew that if everything collapsed, the world would believe the boring accountant was the one with the secret life, not the charming socialite. I looked out at the lights of Manhattan and realized that the skyscraper my father built wasn't just on fire. My brother had soaked the floors in gasoline, and he was just waiting for the right moment to drop the match and walk away with the insurance money while I was still inside. I didn't go home that night. I knew that if I did, I'd lay awake imagining my life in a federal prison. Instead, I started a new file on a private, encrypted drive. I didn't name it Theft or Betrayal. I named it the Sterling Project. If Josh wanted to play a game of high-stakes corporate chess, he was about to find out why you never try to out-calculate the guy who actually knows how to count. It is a terrifying thing to realize that the person you have shared every Christmas with, the person who held your hand at your father's funeral, is currently calculating exactly how much of your life they are willing to sacrifice to keep their own secrets. After that night in the office, everything changed. The very air in the hallways of our firm felt different. It was thicker, harder to breathe, like the oxygen was, being slowly sucked out of the room. I had to walk into work every morning and pretend that I wasn't looking at a stranger when I saw my brother. I had to sit in meetings and listen to him talk about integrity and legacy, while I had an encrypted drive in my pocket that proved he was a thief. The hardest part wasn't the evidence, though. It was the gaslighting. Josh was a master at it. He'd been doing it his whole life, but now that the stakes were life and death, he turned it into an art form. It started about 3 days after I found the Sterling logs. He started coming into my office more often, but he didn't talk about business. He'd just stand there, leaning against the mahogany bookshelf, and look at me with this expression of deep, performative concern. He'd ask me if I was sleeping okay. He'd tell me that I looked a little ragged, and that maybe the stress of the quarterly reports was finally getting to me. At first I thought I was being paranoid, but then I started hearing the echoes of his comments from other people in the firm. Our lead associate, Sarah, stopped me in the break room one afternoon and asked if I was feeling all right. She told me that Josh had mentioned I seemed a bit overwhelmed, and that he was worried I was starting to lose my grip on the finer details of the accounts. I felt a cold shiver go down my spine when she said that. He wasn't just stealing the money anymore. He was building a narrative. He was planting seeds in the minds of our staff that I was mentally unstable, or at the very least suffering from a burnout that made me unreliable with the numbers. That way, if I ever tried to come forward, he could just point to my condition and say I was confused or lash out because I was cracking under the pressure. I remember one specific Tuesday afternoon. We were sitting in a partner meeting with the heads of our legal department. We were discussing a new compliance protocol, and I made a point about the necessity of dual authorization for any offshore transfers. It was a standard, sensible point. But Josh just looked at me, let out a long, slow sigh, and shook his head. He told the room that while he appreciated my attention to detail, we needed to be careful not to let anxiety dictate our firm's efficiency. Then he turned to me, put a hand on my shoulder, and told me in front of everyone that maybe I should take the rest of the week off to clear my head. I looked at his hand on my shoulder. It felt like lead. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to stand up and throw the Sterling audit on the table and watch his face go pale. But I couldn't. Not yet. I just forced a smile, the kind that felt like it was breaking my face, and told him I was fine. I told him I just liked making sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. He just squeezed my shoulder and told the partners that I was the most dedicated man in Manhattan, but that sometimes I didn't know when to quit. The psychological warfare intensified as I went deeper into the Sterling project. I started coming in at 5 a.m. to work on my secret investigation before anyone else arrived, and that's when I realized the Sterling Trust was just the tip of the iceberg. Josh wasn't just stealing from the widow Sterling. He was running a carousel. He'd take money from one account to cover the shortfall in another whenever an audit was due. It was a classic Ponzi-style shell game, but he was doing it within the walls of a legitimate firm. I tracked the money through 3 different layers of offshore shell companies. From Luminance Holdings, it went to a firm in the British Virgin Islands, then to a private equity group in Zurich, and finally, it disappeared into a numbered account in the Caymans. By the time I was finished with the first week of tracking, I realized the total wasn't $12 million. It was closer to $45 million of our clients' money gone. That Friday afternoon, the pressure finally peaked. Josh walked into my office at 4:55 p.m., just as I was getting ready to leave. He had a thick folder in his hand and he looked frantic. He told me that we had an emergency situation with the Miller estate. He said that a deal was about to fall through on a property in London and that he needed my signature on a transfer authorization immediately. He told me the wire had to go out before the London banks closed for the weekend. He set the paper down on my desk and handed me his favorite gold fountain pen. He told me to just sign it, that he'd already checked the numbers, and that he'd explain everything over a drink later. I looked down at the paper. It was a request for a $15 million transfer. But the destination wasn't a real estate firm in London. It was another shell company I'd identified just hours before. I looked up at him. He was hovering over me, his face just inches from mine. I could smell the expensive peppermint gum he chewed to hide the smell of the $200 scotch he'd clearly had for lunch. He told me to come on, that we were losing time, and that I needed to trust him. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought he could see it through my shirt. This was the moment. If I signed this, I was officially an accomplice in a fresh, massive theft. If I didn't sign it, the mask was off. I looked at the gold pen in my hand. I told him I'd love to sign it, but I needed to see the underlying contract for the London property first. I told him our father always said never to sign a wire over 10 million without seeing the contract. The mask slipped for a split second. His eyes went from concerned brother to something sharp and predatory. He told me that he was the senior partner and that he was telling me the contract was solid. He told me I was being difficult and that my obsessive-compulsive tendencies were starting to hurt the firm's reputation. He actually had the nerve to say that if I didn't sign it, he'd have to call a board meeting to discuss my fitness for my role. I didn't blink. I just set the pen down. I told him that if he wanted to call a board meeting, he should go ahead and do it. I told him I'd be happy to discuss my fitness alongside a full independent audit of every account we'd touched in the last 24 months. The room went deathly quiet. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Josh didn't move. He just stared at me, and for the first time, the charisma was completely gone. He reached out, grabbed the folder off my desk and tucked it under his arm. He told me that I was making a huge mistake. He said that family is supposed to have each other's backs, and that I was clearly lost. He walked out of the office without another word. I sat there for 20 minutes, just staring at the empty space where he'd been standing. My hands were shaking so much I had to tuck them under my legs. I knew that the art of the gaslight was over. The war had officially started. But as I sat there, I realized something even more disturbing. Josh wasn't just stealing to fund his lifestyle. He was stealing because he was in debt. I'd seen a glimpse of a name in the Miller folder before he snatched it back. It was a name associated with some of the most dangerous private lenders in the city. My brother wasn't just a thief. He was a man drowning, and he was trying to use my body as a flotation device. I realized that if I didn't end this now, he wouldn't just go to prison, he'd get us both killed. I opened my laptop and sent a single encrypted email to an old contact I had at the IRS. I didn't tell them everything. I just gave them one name, one account number, and a promise that if they looked into it, they'd find the biggest white-collar catch of the decade. The die was cast. There was no going back to the way things were. I was about to destroy my family's legacy to save my soul, and as I walked out of the building that night, I wondered if I'd ever be able to forgive myself for what I was about to do. After that confrontation in my office, the air between me and Josh didn't just turn cold. It turned lethal. We were still showing up to the same building every day, still sharing the same mahogany-paneled elevator, but we had stopped being brothers. We were two predators circling each other in a glass cage. I knew he was looking for a way to push me out, to officially label me as having a nervous breakdown, so he could take full control of the keys. And he knew that I was digging. The problem for Josh was that he always underestimated the ghost. He thought that because I didn't have his charisma, I didn't have his teeth. I went completely underground within my own firm. I stopped using my office computer for anything sensitive. I started bringing in a clean laptop in my gym bag every morning, using a hidden mobile hotspot so I wouldn't leave a single footprint on the firm's internal Wi-Fi. I spent my lunch hours in the back of a dingy coffee shop 3 blocks away, staring at spreadsheets that would make a seasoned federal prosecutor dizzy. The thing about forensic accounting is that it's like following a trail of blood in the dark. Josh was clever, but he was also arrogant. He thought that by layering the transfers through enough shell companies he could make the money disappear. But the thing is, money never really disappears. It just changes shape. I started with that company I'd seen in the Miller folder, the one called Luminance Holdings. I spent 18 hours straight one weekend tracing its registration. It led back to a registered agent in Delaware, who led to a nominee director in the British Virgin Islands. That's when I hit the first wall. The BVI is a black hole for transparency. But I remembered something my dad told me when I first started at the firm. He said that every thief has a signature move, a little quirk they can't help but repeat. I started looking at the dates of the transfers. They weren't random. Every single major wire Josh had forged occurred exactly 48 hours after a specific private jet had landed at Teterboro Airport. I felt a pit in my stomach as I cross-referenced the flight logs. The jet was registered to a holding company owned by a man named Victor Vance. Now, if you're in the New York legal world, you know that name, but you never say it out loud. Vance was a fixer for people who had more money than morals. He specialized in high-interest private lending for the kind of people who couldn't go to a bank because their collateral was either illegal or non-existent. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Josh wasn't just stealing to buy Porsches and Patek Philippe's, he was paying off a debt. I did some more digging, pushing my luck with some old contacts in the compliance world, and the picture finally became clear. Josh hadn't just made aggressive moves in crypto. He'd lost a staggering amount of money, nearly $30 million, in a leveraged play that had gone sideways during a market crash 2 years ago, and he hadn't used his own money to make that play. He'd borrowed it from Vance. I sat there in that coffee shop, my coffee cold and my head spinning. My brother owed $30 million to a man who didn't use lawyers to collect his debts. That's why the Sterling Trust was being drained. That's why the Miller estate was being raided. Josh was in a race against time, trying to pay back a shark before the shark decided to take a pound of flesh. And he was using me as his human shield. The scale of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just $45 million anymore. As I dug through the hidden ledgers Josh had tucked away in the back end of our server, I found that he had compromised nearly a dozen of our top-tier accounts. The total was pushing $60 million. If this went public, the firm wouldn't just be sued. We'd be liquidated. The name on the door, the legacy my father had spent his life building, would be a punchline in the Wall Street Journal. I remember coming home that night and just standing in my kitchen, staring at a photo of me and Josh from 10 years ago. We were on a boat in Maine, both of us laughing, both of us looking like we had the whole world in front of us. I looked at his face in the photo and I tried to find the man who was currently plotting my downfall. I couldn't see him. I realized then that the brother I loved had died somewhere between the leveraged buyouts and the vanity. The person in that corner office was just a shell of a man, driven by fear and greed. I knew I had to make a move. I couldn't wait for the IRS to find him. If they did it their way, they'd come in with a sledgehammer and destroy everything, including me. I had to do it with a scalpel. The next morning, I did something incredibly dangerous. I walked into Josh's office while he was out at lunch. I knew his assistant was away from her desk, and I knew his password because, honestly, he was too lazy to change it from the one he'd used since college. I sat at his desk, my heart hammering so loud I was sure people could hear it through the walls. I accessed his private email. I only had about 5 minutes. I scrolled through his recent correspondence until I found what I was looking for. An email from an encrypted address with no subject line. It just said, Friday, 5 p.m. The Sterling account needs another 5. Or we talk to the ghost. My blood turned to ice. The ghost. They were talking about me. They were using me as leverage against him. They knew I was the one who could expose them, and they were threatening Josh with my safety to keep the money flowing. And the worst part? Josh's reply was already there. He'd written back, I'll have it ready. My brother's handled. He won't be a problem. I felt a wave of nausea. He won't be a problem. I wondered what that meant in Josh's world. Did it mean he was going to frame me by Friday? Or did it mean something worse? I copied the email thread to my encrypted drive and got out of there just as I heard his distinctive laugh coming down the hallway. I retreated to my office, locked the door, and sat on the floor. I needed to breathe. I needed a plan that didn't just stop the theft but also kept me out of a shallow grave. That's when I realized that Josh had given me the perfect weapon. He was planning one last, massive wire transfer from the Sterling Trust on Friday at 5 p.m. $5 million. It was going to be his final payment to Vance, the one that supposedly bought him his freedom. I spent the next 48 hours preparing the honeypot. I used my administrative access to create a dummy account within our system. To anyone looking at the surface, it looked like a legitimate offshore holding for the Sterling family. But in reality, it was a monitored account. I linked it directly to a contact I'd established at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I told my contact, a guy named Miller who sounded like he hadn't slept since the 90s, that a major wire was going to hit this account on Friday. I told him that if he monitored the transfer, he'd see the exact path the money took through the shell companies. I told him I'd provide the digital signature logs that proved who was actually behind the keyboard. Miller asked me why I was doing this. He told me that if the firm went down, I'd be out of a job and my family name would be ruined. I remember sitting there, looking at the Park Avenue skyline, and telling him that my family name was already ruined. I was just the only one who had realized it yet. The tension in the office on Thursday was unbearable. Josh was acting strangely nice. He kept stopping by my desk asking if I wanted to grab dinner, telling me how much he appreciated me. It was the most disgusting thing I've ever experienced. He was fattening the calf before the slaughter. He was making sure that on Friday I was relaxed, unsuspecting, and ready to take the fall. I played along. I told him I was feeling much better. I told him that I'd realized he was right about me being stressed and that I was planning on taking a long vacation starting next week. He grinned at me, that big, hollow Josh grin, and told me I deserved it. He said, "You have no idea how much better things are going to be for both of us after this weekend." I knew exactly what he meant. He thought he was going to be debt-free, and I was going to be the prime suspect in a $60 million embezzlement case. But as I watched him walk away, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't the ghost. I was the one holding the match, and I was going to wait until he was standing right in the middle of his house of cards before I dropped it. I stayed late that Thursday night, finishing the code that would trigger an automatic alert to the IRS the second Josh hit send on that Friday transfer. I also did one more thing. I wrote a letter to our father. He was in a memory care facility now, his mind mostly gone, but I needed to put the words down. I told him I was sorry. I told him I tried to save the skyscraper, but the foundation was made of sand. I left the office at midnight, the city lights blurred by the rain on my windshield. I knew that tomorrow by this time my life as I knew it would be over. There would be no more Park Avenue office. There would be no more dashing duo. There would just be the truth. And the truth was going to be the most expensive thing I've ever bought. Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of a bruised ego. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror for a long time, adjusting my tie, wondering if this was the last time I'd ever dress for this life. I felt like a man walking toward a gallows I had built with my own hands. People think that when you're about to take down a villain, you feel like a hero. You don't. You just feel tired. You feel the weight of every memory, every shared meal, and every childhood secret being crushed under the necessity of what's coming. The office was eerily quiet when I walked in. It was like the building itself knew the foundation was about to buckle. Josh was already there, which was rare for him. He was standing by the window in the lounge, a cup of espresso in his hand, looking out at the city like he owned every square inch of it. He turned when he saw me and gave me a thumbs up. He told me that today was going to be a big day for the firm. He said we were finally going to clear the slate and start fresh. I just nodded and told him I hoped so. By 3 p.m., the atmosphere had shifted from quiet to suffocating. Josh kept checking his watch every 5 minutes. I stayed in my office, my door cracked just enough to see the hallway. At 4:15 p.m., he walked in. He didn't knock, he just closed the door behind him and sat on the edge of my desk. He looked energized, almost manic. He told me that the Miller property deal was back on, and the wire needed to go out right at 5 p.m. to hit the closing window. Then he did exactly what I knew he would do. He set a laptop down in front of me. It was my laptop. He'd borrowed it from my bag while I was in a meeting earlier that morning. He told me that his own computer was having connection issues, and that since I was the one who usually handled the final compliance checks, it only made sense for me to execute the transfer from my station. He was leaning over me, his hand on the back of my chair, effectively pinning me into the desk. He told me to log in. He said he'd already pre-filled the details on the Sterling account portal, and all I had to do was use my master key to authorize the final $5 million. I looked at the screen. The destination account was the one I'd been tracking, the one linked to Vance. I looked up at him. I asked him if he was sure about this. I asked him if there was any other way to handle the debt without touching Eleanor Sterling's money again. The color drained from his face for a split second. He asked me what I was talking about. He tried to laugh it off, telling me I was speaking in riddles again, but I didn't stop. I told him I knew about Vance. I told him I knew about the $30 million loss in the crypto markets. I told him I'd seen the emails. Josh didn't explode. He didn't even move. He just stood there, and his face became a mask of cold, hard stone. He told me that I needed to be very careful about what I said next. He told me that if I didn't hit that send button, the people waiting for that money weren't going to come for him. They were going to come for me. He actually had the nerve to say he was doing this to protect me. He said he'd made it look like I was the one who lost the money, so if Vance didn't get paid, Vance would see me as the person who owed him. It was the ultimate betrayal. He wasn't just framing me for the theft. He was using me as a human shield against a literal hitman. I looked at the clock on my wall. 4:58 p.m. I told him I wasn't going to sign it. I told him I'd already contacted our board of directors and that they were in the conference room right now, waiting for an explanation. Josh's eyes went wide. He told me I was bluffing. He said the board wouldn't listen to the quiet brother over the man who brought in all their business. He reached over my shoulder and tried to grab the mouse, tried to force the cursor toward the authorize button. We were actually struggling over the desk, two grown men in $5,000 suits acting like children fighting over a toy. But I wasn't fighting for the mouse. I was just waiting for the clock to hit 5:00 p.m. The second the digital clock flipped, my computer screen didn't refresh with a confirmation. Instead, every light in the office flickered and then died, leaving us in the gray twilight of the late afternoon. Then, the door to my office didn't just open. It was pushed open with authority. It wasn't the board of directors. It was 6 men and women in windbreakers with IRSCI printed in bold yellow letters across the back. Josh froze. He still had his hand on my laptop. He looked at the agents, then back at me, his mouth hanging open. One of the agents, a woman with a face like flint, walked over and told Josh to step away from the computer. She told him they had a warrant for the seizure of all digital assets and that he was being detained for questioning in relation to a $60 million embezzlement and tax evasion scheme. Josh tried to regain his composure. He tried to use the golden boy charm one last time. He told them there must be a mistake. He pointed at me and told them that I was the one who handled the books. He said, "He's the one you want. He's been acting erratically for months. I was just here trying to fix a mistake he made." The agent didn't even blink. She told him they'd been monitoring the connection for the last 48 hours. She said they had the keystroke logs and the IP tracking that proved the authorizations came from his office and that they'd just witnessed him attempting to force a transfer from my terminal. That was the moment Josh's soul finally left his body. He slumped into a chair, all the charisma and the height and the arrogance just evaporating. He looked small. For the first time in my life, my big brother looked like a frightened little boy. They led him out of the office in handcuffs. They didn't put a jacket over his wrists. They led him right through the main lobby, past the junior associates who were staring in shock, past the portraits of our father and grandfather. I followed them at a distance, watching as they put him into the back of a black SUV. Just before they closed the door, Josh looked at me. There was no anger in his eyes anymore. Just this profound, hollow emptiness. He asked me why I couldn't have just let it go. He said, "We were family. We were supposed to be forever." I stood on the sidewalk of Park Avenue as the SUV pulled away into the New York traffic. I told the empty air that family doesn't use family as a target. I went back up to the office. The agents were still there, boxing up files, pulling hard drives. The place was a crime scene. I walked into the conference room where the board of directors was actually sitting in stunned silence. I didn't wait for them to ask questions. I set a folder on the table. It contained the full forensic audit I'd spent months preparing. It showed exactly how much was gone, which accounts were compromised, and how I'd already moved to freeze the remaining assets to protect the clients. I told them that I was resigning, effective immediately. I told them that the firm of Hargrave & Sons was dead, and that the best thing they could do was liquidate what was left and try to make the Sterlings and the Millers whole again. The chairman of the board, a man who had known my father for 50 years, asked me where I was going to go. He asked me what I was going to do now that I'd destroyed my own inheritance. I looked at the mahogany table, the view of the park, and the expensive art on the walls. I told him that I'd rather be a ghost with a clean conscience than a king in a house built on theft. The aftermath was a slow, painful disintegration. The news hit the papers the next morning. Park Avenue prince arrested in $60 million heist. The firm folded within 30 days. Every client pulled their money, and the lawsuits started rolling in. I spent the next 6 months in and out of depositions, giving the government everything they needed to put Josh away for a long, long time. The bittersweet part wasn't the loss of the money. I had enough of my own savings to survive. The bittersweet part was the silence. My phone stopped ringing. The friends we had in the city vanished. I went to see my father one last time before the story broke. I sat with him in the garden of his facility. He didn't know who I was. He just looked at me and asked if I'd seen his sons lately. He told me he was so proud of them, that they were building something that would last forever. I just held his hand and told him that the skyscraper was finished. I told him it was the tallest thing in the city, and that everyone would remember the name Hargrave. I didn't tell him it would be for all the wrong reasons. I eventually moved out of Manhattan. I bought a small house in the woods upstate, far away from the sound of sirens and the pressure of the ledger. I still do accounting work, but now I do it for small businesses and non-profits. It's quiet work, honest work. Every now and then, I get a letter from the prison where Josh is serving his 15-year sentence. I haven't opened any of them. I keep them in a shoebox, under my bed. Maybe one day I'll be ready to read his excuses, or his apologies, or his threats. But for now, I just enjoy the silence. I realized that my father was right. It only takes one person with a match to burn it all down. But what he didn't tell us is that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to let the building burn and walk away into the night before the roof collapses. I lost my brother, I lost my legacy, and I lost my name. But as I sit on my porch and watch the sun set over the trees, I realize that for the first time in my life, I'm finally not a ghost. I'm just a man, and that's more than Josh will ever be.
Thanks for watching and listening to Manhattan Exposes. What story would you like to hear next? Drop it in the comments below, and kindly leave a like and subscribe to hear more stories like this. Until next time.